Raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, bright copper kettles and warm woolen mittens, brown paper packages tied up with strings. These are a few of my favorite things.
Hello all, I'm the Film Bastard and welcome back. That insufferable decade of our Lord 1990 was a great time to be alive, wasn't it? Angsty grunge was just giving way to insufferable pop, MTV was just getting out of the music video business, and Terry Gilliam gave us his 1998 adaptation of the 1971 Hunter S. Thompson novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and you know, when you put it that way, 1990 kinda sucked, didn't it? A lot of people will be familiar with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas because of the Google Deep Dream clips that were uploaded to YouTube that everyone lost their shit over. But before it was the internet's nightmare fuel, it was cinematic nightmare fuel. And before even then, it was the most celebrated work of one of the finest voices of the American counterculture we ever had. Hunter Thompson's Romano Clay was said to be an unfilmable work. And I have to tend to agree. However, in the same vein as Zack Snyder's Watchmen, this box office failure is probably as close as we're ever going to come. No studio in the world is going to sink more money into such a non-traditionally Hollywood film as they did this one again.
Where are some golf shoes? Otherwise we'll never get out of this place alive.
With that in mind, let's strap on our disappointment crash helmets and dive right into Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. The film stars the Mad Captain Scissorhands as Raoul Duke, Hunter Thompson's alter ego. It also stars Benicio del Toro as Dr. Gonzo, which was a pseudonym for Chicano activist Oscar Acosta. They're on their way to Nevada to cover a race for an unnamed publication which was totally not Sports Illustrated. You'll notice immediately that the film never stays still for more than a second or two at a time. It's absolutely bursting at the seams with frenetic energy, either from the camera itself or from the jagged and malfunctioning mechanical movements of its leads. They pick up hitchhiking Tobey Maguire, and after threatening him with death if he decides to make another Spider-Man film, the two make it to Las Vegas. Now herein lies one of the film's only glaring aesthetic problems, but it is a major one.
I was right in the middle of a fucking reptile zoo. And somebody was giving booze to these goddamn things. It won't be long now before they tear us to shreds.
Okay. Ralph Steadman is an English illustrator whose work is the visual representation of Thompson's written word. Anytime Thompson gets mentioned, the impossible shapes and ink splatters of Steadman's work is often not far behind. But we don't see any of that in the film. In fact, the only time that Steadman's work is ever referenced is in the reflection of Duke's glasses in the beginning of the film. In fact, early talks were supposed to see Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas as an illustrated feature in Steadman's style. You know, you could have even kept up the motif of seeing Ralph Steadman's illustrations in the reflective surfaces of the bar. It could be a hallucination that only Duke is susceptible to. But no. Somebody decided that the best visual representation of Ralph Steadman's illustrations would be the velociraptors that somebody bummed off of Steven Spielberg's garage sale. Whatever. It. Duke arrives at the race with his photographer, not John C. McGinley. After mistaking the desert surroundings for a war zone, Duke wanders off the story, huffs an American flag full of ether, and ends up at Circus Circus. After running into a few brief celebrity cameos, Duke and Gonzo end up at the Carousel Bar. The chaotic nature and spinning bar turn Gonzo onto a bad trip. The mise-en-scène here is particularly interesting when Duke mentions that they're in the vortex of the American dream. Duke and Gonzo are back in their hotel room, ruminating about the events of the day, when the story flashes back to when Gonzo threatened a TV crew with a knife in an elevator. You know, credit to the movie, it doesn't need a cheesy sound effect or weird transition to denote that you're in a flashback. The subduedness of the scene in the elevator is enough to denote that it must be a different time in the narrative events. Gonzo chases Duke out of the room with the aforementioned big knife, and Duke decides to blow off some steam by losing at a game of Big Six. When he returns to the room, he finds Gonzo attempting to commit suicide by Jefferson Airplane. Duke attempts to hide under a cardboard box, but Gonzo's operating on the level of your average Metal Gear soldier. After some long drawn-out nothing, we get to one of the most important bits of the movie. Finally. Duke remembers a time in the 60s where he sees himself, briefly, taking a hit of lysergic in the bathroom of a hippie underground club. He takes half the acid but spills the rest on the sleeve of his red woolen shirt. This is no problem for Flea, who begins going to town on the spilled drugs. Enter this guy. Keep that yuppie in mind for the rest of the review, okay? People often mistake this next monologue, a central theme from the book, as a central theme from the movie. Thompson said it was one of the finest things that he'd ever written. Let's take a listen for a little bit.
No mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive, in that corner of time in the world. Whatever it meant. Less than 5 years later, you can go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you can almost see the high water mark. That place where the wave finally broke and rolled back.
You know, great prose though it may be, these narration bits always seemed out of place. Like the movie's trying just a little bit too hard to emulate the feel of the book. In the morning, Duke wakes up to find that Gonzo has fled, leaving a convertible full of drugs, hotel sundries, and a room service bill to match that of the national debt to Duke. Of course, he's going to do the responsible thing by fleeing the hotel into the desert like a bat out of hell. After some weirdness with Gary Busey and Tobey Maguire, Duke finally gets a hold of Gonzo, who tells him that his next assignment is on the National District Attorney's Conference on Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in Las Vegas. Thompson walks into an argument between Roger Predactor and the guy from True Blood before checking into his hotel room, which is already occupied by Wednesday Addams and Gonzo the Last Airbender. They attend the conference, but they can only stand so many out-of-touch drug culture theories before they leave. Back in their room, Duke takes a hit of the fictional drug adrenochrome, purportedly taken directly from the human pineal gland. After the film takes a brief detour down Rob Zombie Boulevard, Duke awakens to a familiar sight: a trashed hotel room and no attorney to be found. Duke plays the recorder that he's bondage strapped to himself and tries to piece together the duo's last night in Las Vegas, attempting to buy a destructive orangutan from Circus Circus, tackling a room service lady, and holding up a dive diner with a big knife. The sequence ends with Gonzo being driven to the airport, and Duke going on a savage burn towards LA across the Nevada wastes. Blessedly, this is where the film decides to stop. So that was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Film adaptation is a tricky business, particularly when the source text is as well regarded as Fear and Loathing is. Based on its own merits, this is actually a really good film. The plot is absurdist, it's always relatively engaging, and the use of color and lighting techniques to simulate an altered state is second to none. But because it called itself Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, it set up an unrealistic expectation for itself from the very beginning. As I mentioned before, this was something of a box office failure. In fact, the film ended up losing Universal Studios somewhere in the neighborhood of $8 million. What the film did accomplish, though, was starting a renaissance in the popularity of Thompson and his work. And that is where the yuppie in the bathroom comes into play. Thompson's was a voice that spoke uniquely of the counterculture, the possibilities therein, and ultimately of its downfall. But drug use was never the focus of the work the same way it was in Fear and Loathing. Thompson wrote exhaustively about sports, politics, religion, and the human condition. Fear and Loathing, however, created a myth about the man that he found it hard to maintain, and I would argue ultimately ended up killing him. Why then is Fear and Loathing the work that people most closely identify Thompson with? Let's imagine that you're the yuppie in the bathroom for a second. You walk in on a man eating drugs off the sleeve of another. You have two options. You can be scared by what you see and leave the bathroom, Your life is ruined because you think that behind every door, there's the possibility that people are engaged in thrills that you could never possibly understand. Or, like a good journalist, you can be inquisitive and find that there's a light full of wonderful things at the other end of the trip. Another way that one can approach Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is through the use of fidelity criticism. One has to ask themselves whether or not a film can be judged as good based solely off its fidelity towards the source text. In this case, the film is actually fairly loyal to the original text, but maybe a little bit too much. Terry Gilliam's film is like a Broadway production of what Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas should be. It's a loud, bombastic, over-budgeted wild goose chase for the American dream that has been dead for decades prior.
I would leave the doctor alone until after he's eaten his breakfast because he's a very crude man.
It doesn't really seem like the movie was made for audiences who grew up reading Thompson's book in the 70s, nor does it really serve as a gateway for new audiences to discover the rest of Thompson's work.
That sure was a fun trip to Las Vegas.
Too many kids.
Exactly. This was nothing more than children screaming and running around Las Vegas. You know, it really should be judged as a work of its own media. And based as a separate film, it's not exactly a bad one. There's a reason it's preserved in the Criterion Collection, after all.
Yeah.
But we're not really here to talk about literature, are we? The film gave a broad audience a great idea of what a multi-million-dollar budgeted experimental film could look like. The cast, particularly the supporting actors, are great and memorable, the writing is spot on, most of the visual effects are fairly impressive for their time, and it's always nice to see the adapted work of a literary hero live on the big screen.
What's the score here? What's next?
Whether you're hip or square, one thing is for certain. Once you've seen Fear and Loathing, it's impossible to unsee it. You bought the ticket and you took the ride. Now it's up to you to decide whether or not you had fun. I'm the Film Bastard, and as always, until our next review, Sic Semper Cinema.